It all began with Haru, our protagonist, in the midst of a dense forest alongside his companions. They were engaged in a difficult battle against a group of goblins, creatures that, at first glance, shouldn't pose much of a threat. Despite using all their strength, the young warriors couldn't defeat the enemies easily. During the clash, one of Haru's teammates tried to cast a spell, but ended up injured. Another member of the group promptly used healing magic to help him, which surprised Haru, not only because of the action itself, but also due to the unexpected strength of the goblins, who were always considered the weakest among the so-called Dark G. Yet there, in that hostile and suffocating setting, what should have been a simple skirmish turned into a real fight for survival. Haru began to notice that, for some reason, those goblins were far more powerful than expected. The next morning, even before the sun had risen over the horizon, Haru awoke. Ranta, his companion, told him it was time to get up, just as Manato announced that breakfast would soon be ready. The two chatted briefly and then headed down to eat, where the rest of the group was already gathered. Moguzo, who led the meal preparations, enthusiastically commented that he loved cooking and hoped everyone would enjoy what he had made. Within minutes, the boys were all seated, enjoying the meal. Manato then turned to Haru and Ranta, asking if they were feeling better. He explained that while healing magic had treated their injuries, it couldn't replace the blood they had lost. Haru replied that he felt fine, though still a bit dizzy, but thought it was nothing to worry about. Soon, the group began discussing their next steps. They needed to acquire some items, but the task proved difficult, as they hadn't managed to defeat a single monster so far. The fight against two goblins the day before had been extremely tough, leading them to conclude that, for now, they should focus on isolated targets. Manato advised them to follow this strategy, reminding them that this wasn't just an ordinary game, their lives were at stake. This remark caused a strange discomfort in Haru, who questioned what Manato meant by game. The latter simply replied that he wasn't sure why he had said that. Haru then drifted into thought. He recalled how, from the beginning, they all had certain words and concepts in mind that felt familiar, yet they no longer understood their meaning. It was as if they had fragmented memories, impossible to access completely. Most of them remembered nothing before the moment they had awakened in this new world. Haru saw himself back in the moment when he opened his eyes in a dark space. Other voices echoed around him, and seconds later a door opened, revealing that they were in a tower. He didn't recognize any of the faces around him, nor did he have any memories of family or friends. They decided to ask two guards where they were. Shortly after, they were taken to a man named Britt. Britt introduced himself as the commander of the volunteer soldiers and informed them that they were in Grimgar. He said he was pleased to meet such a determined individual. However, Renji expressed his distrust, accusing Britt of suspicious behavior, which deeply angered the commander. Impulsively, Britt drew a dagger and threatened Renji, who, to everyone's surprise, grabbed the blade with his bare hands, ignoring the cut. The unexpected reaction impressed Britt, who, instead of punishing him, stated that this was exactly the kind of person he was looking for. As a reward, he offered each of them a pouch containing 10 silver coins if they agreed to join his group. It was then that Haru realized he didn't have his phone. Confused, he reflected on what a phone even was, as the word now felt strange and void of meaning. Britt explained that if they killed monsters and sold their parts, they could earn enough money to buy a special uniform that would bring certain advantages, as that was the essence of being volunteer soldiers. He also warned them that without effort and determination, death was a certain consequence. The next day, Haru found himself on the border of human territory. Those lands were dangerous, filled with monsters and hostile races. The border brigade was responsible for handling these threats, as the regular army was overwhelmed with protecting the cities. Among the volunteers, Renji managed to gather a few and form his own group, even obtaining official brigade tags. Haru and the others formed a different team, led by Manato. After registering with a guild, each of them received only 2 silver coins. They then realized the need to save and buy only what was essential for survival. They discussed their options, and each chose a guild. Haru joined the Thieves Guild. Upon entering, he was fascinated by the unusual atmosphere. He was abruptly greeted by a girl who jumped on him, intrigued by the presence of a volunteer soldier there. She explained that the guild was strict, and that severe punishments would be applied if he couldn't keep up. Determined to improve, Haru accepted the challenge. The young woman introduced herself as Barbara and assured him that upon completing his training, he would receive a special nickname. After a week of intense training, Haru fulfilled all the requirements and was nicknamed Old Cat. His friends were successful too. Moguzo became a knight, Ranta a dragon knight, Yume a hunter, Shijo a mage, and Manato assumed the role of priest. Despite their achievements, internal conflicts arose. Ranta expressed doubt about Yume's abilities, who, embarrassed, admitted she wasn't very accurate with her bow. This only increased Ranta's impatience, who sarcastically commented that at least Shijo seemed to display his abilities in a more expressive way. The argument between the three intensified, with Ranta showing his arrogant and controlling nature. It was Manato who intervened, supported by Moguzo, reminding everyone that they couldn't afford to waste time. The night was approaching, and the presence of monsters made the environment even more dangerous. Obeying their leader, they pressed on for a few more hours until they found a goblin camp. However, the number of enemies was far too great for them to attempt a direct attack. Yume, visibly frustrated, complained that even the goblins seemed to be eating better than they were, which also discouraged Haru. After all, it had already been 13 days since they arrived in that world, and hunger was starting to set in. Their money was running out, and they knew they needed to find some resources as soon as possible. Since the expedition that day had also yielded no results, the group was now placing their hopes in the approaching night. While everyone rested in search of renewed energy, the protagonist was awakened by a strange noise coming from outside. Driven by curiosity, and perhaps a faint premonition, he decided to get up and investigate, even though the others were still sound asleep. Upon stepping out, he found Manato, who was returning at that very moment. To his surprise, he carried the subtle scent of alcohol. The protagonist, confused, admitted he didn't know Manato drank, to which Manato responded with a faint smile, explaining that he had found a small tavern nearby where volunteer soldiers like them would gather. He had gone there in search of useful information. With excitement, Manato revealed he had discovered the location of a territory where, supposedly, there were creatures even they could defeat. The protagonist, eager at the possibility, suggested they should go to that tavern together next time. Manato then asked if he knew whether he could drink, to which the boy replied he had never tried. As they exchanged stories, they talked about their time in the guilds. Manato mentioned that he had an extremely strict mentor who shouted more than he taught, and that he had felt relieved when he finally completed his training. While they talked, the protagonist noticed the red hue covering the moon. That color was unfamiliar to him, and the strangeness of it reminded him just how distant this world felt from everything he once knew. The next morning, already within the forest, the group spotted a lone goblin near a stream. The protagonist immediately warned the others, who organized a surprise attack. Yume, with precision, fired an arrow that slowed the enemy's advance, creating an opening for the protagonist to approach. Even though he knew that, as a thief, his role wasn't direct combat, he rushed in to buy time. He tried to strike the creature's wrist, but only managed a light cut. The others soon arrived and surrounded the goblin, appointing Moguzo to face the creature head-on. Ranta, for his part, took advantage of a moment of distraction and drove his sword in forcefully. The goblin's scream filled the air, and Ranta trembled as he felt the blade pierce flesh and muscle. The monster's desperation was clear. It didn't want to die, and that was obvious to everyone. And in some way, the protagonist understood that fear. Perhaps if he were in the goblin's place, he would feel the same. As the goblin cried out to survive, Ranta kept fighting. Yume then commented that everyone fears death, and this, in a way, motivated the protagonist to act. Shu, with her magic, struck the monster, creating another opening. The protagonist lunged forward and, with a slash, forced the goblin to retreat. However, when he threw his dagger, it hit the creature's shoulder, causing it to fall, screaming in pain. The goblin leaped on him, trying to strangle him. In a movement of pure instinct, the protagonist used his free arm to stab the dagger into the enemy's neck. Ranta intervened with another blow, allowing Moguzo to finish the fight with his massive sword. The group, though exhausted, could hardly believe they had won. Yume handed the dagger back to the protagonist, while Manato healed his wounds with magic. Ranta, curious, searched the goblin's body and found a tooth and a coin tied to its necklace. He knew that, to earn a special vice, he had to present a piece of the defeated monster. But upon hearing that the final blow had been dealt by Moguzo, he started an argument, unaware that the goblin was still alive. With a final effort, the wounded creature rose and tried to flee, but Ranta chased it down and knocked it over. In the midst of the confrontation, he stabbed the creature repeatedly, even as the others watched in astonishment. It was clear that this goblin wasn't fighting out of violence. It just wanted to live. Realizing what he had done, Ranta broke into tears. The protagonist, frozen, noticed that his hands were numb and that blood was still dripping, leaving him in shock. Hours later, they returned to the city and sold what they had recovered. For a damaged silver coin, They received only 30 copper coins, far less than they expected. However, upon noticing the goblin tooth necklace, the merchant offered a silver coin, saying it was excellent for crafting amulets against evil energies. After the sales, Manato suggested they rest and enjoy the day to relax. Everyone agreed. The protagonist, however, noticed that Ranta seemed downcast and barely spoke. He chose to respect his silence and went off to explore the city while the others went about their own ways. Ranta, in the end, went to eat the meat he had been craving. The girls went to a clothing store. Moguzo mended his clothes and cleaned his sword, while Manato rested. Later on, Manato noticed that Shu was eyeing an artifact with interest and discreetly bought it for her, which made the girl quite flustered. The protagonist, meanwhile, approached Ranta, noticing she was still lost in thought. The girl remarked that at least she had earned her first vice, which would be useful in future battles. The protagonist asked what would happen if someone collected several vices. Ranta explained that, in that case, it would be possible to summon a demon that could detect enemies, becoming a powerful ally. They both then noticed the sunset before them. It was such a beautiful view that, until that moment, they hadn't even realized. The protagonist silently agreed. Those views were truly enchanting. That night, he reflected on everything that had happened. He called out to Manato, intending to ask why each of them had received only 18 copper coins. However, when he tried to speak, the words simply wouldn't come. He chose to drop the question and said it was best to get some rest. It was then that Ranta appeared, cheerful, suggesting they go for a bath. The protagonist found it odd, since they had all bathed earlier. He quickly realized Ranta's true intention, to peek at the girls in the bath. Although they tried to stop him, Ranta ran. As soon as he burst into the place, he was violently thrown out by the furious girls, ending up unconscious outside. The next morning, determined not to be a nuisance again, the protagonist woke up very early. Upon reaching the kitchen, he noticed that Moguzo was already there, preparing breakfast. Curious, he asked why he was doing it since it wasn't his turn to cook. Moguzo, with a calm smile, replied that he simply enjoyed cooking for others. For him, the order didn't matter. What truly mattered was the happiness on people's faces when eating something made with care. Hearing that, the protagonist expressed his gratitude. He said everyone really appreciated his meals, and personally, he had no idea what they'd be eating if not for him. Those sincere words made the atmosphere even warmer. Since everything was ready, the protagonist said he would go wake the others so they could all have breakfast together in a few minutes. When they gathered, the boys apologized for the previous incident, except for Ranta, who downplayed the whole thing, saying he didn't expect to find anyone there. It was a weak excuse. The place, already worn by time, didn't stop him from entering even though he could barely see anything. His veiled confession that he wanted to sneak into the area made Yume even angrier. Hours later, under the rain at the campsite, the protagonist noticed the growing distance between the boys and girls. They barely spoke since the incident, and the tension in the air was obvious. He waited a bit, then decided to act. He went out with Yume to search for tracks nearby. The search led them to a recently used campfire. By analyzing the footprints around it, the protagonist concluded that there had been at least 3 goblins there, which represented a serious risk. Facing them would be nearly impossible. On the way back to camp, the protagonist struck up a conversation with Yume and apologized. He knew Ranta was entirely to blame. Yume nodded slightly. She admitted that the incident had affected Shiju more than her, but made it clear that Ranta shouldn't behave like that. He was crossing a line. The protagonist agreed and later explained to the group that, under their current conditions, it wasn't possible to go after those goblins. The best decision was to return. Back home, they spent several days without earning any money. The bad weather and the scarcity of monsters made everything harder. One night, the protagonist decided to wash his clothes. As he scrubbed the worn fabrics, he felt a heavy weight upon seeing how patched and fragile they were. He knew he'd soon need new clothes, but buying anything was nearly impossible with so little money. Even so, he finished the task and left the bathroom. Upon returning, a soft scent in the air caught him off guard. Curious, he thought about Yume's clothes. If he was struggling, he imagined how she must be coping. It was awkward to think about how little she might have. Then Yume appeared and greeted him. A bit flustered, he quickly responded and stepped away. He didn't want her to think he was there with ulterior motives. A few meters later, he found Ranta, who was getting ready to go wash his clothes. The protagonist immediately tried to stop him, saying that in that rain, nothing would dry by the next day. He even lied, saying he regretted washing his own clothes. The intention was clear: to prevent Ranta from running into the girls in the bathroom and causing more trouble. After convincing him, the protagonist finally returned to the room, feeling a bit more at ease. The next morning, everyone set out toward the ruins of Demura. Once a capital city, the place was now no more than a crumbling memory, overrun by goblins. The group headed toward the outskirts, avoiding the center where hundreds of creatures gathered. After a long search among the abandoned buildings, the protagonist spotted a sleeping goblin. He immediately called the others. Manato organized the attack. Ranta and the protagonist would strike first, while Moguzo would engage the goblin if it awoke, with support from the girls at a distance. They followed the plan. The creature was struck with a clean hit, part of its head destroyed before it could react. The protagonist was surprised by how effective the approach was. He checked the monster's belongings and, to his joy, found 4 silver coins and other useful items. It was the best loot they had ever secured. Manato, ever cautious, warned the group. Even though it was easy this time, they couldn't count on luck forever. They were still in enemy territory and had to stay alert. Even so, Ranta didn't hold back from celebrating. He proudly stated that he had wielded his sword bravely and caused most of the damage. Manato acknowledged this, and for a moment, allowed them to celebrate. The mood among them improved considerably, and the protagonist felt lighter seeing the tension dissipate. In the following hours, the group continued hunting lone goblins. When they encountered larger groups, up to 5, they would retreat. They also took the opportunity to draw a map of the explored areas, which would be useful in the future. With a few more enemies defeated, the accumulated loot grew. They were excited, especially the protagonist, who could finally afford new clothes. Later, after negotiating a lot with a vendor, even Ranta and Moguzo enjoyed a good meal. A few hours later, the protagonist was examining his dagger when Manato noticed something. Several names were engraved on it. He explained that he did his best to keep the weapon in great condition. Moguzo and Ranta, who had gone out to buy ingredients, returned. The protagonist warned about the risk of food spoiling, but Manato assured him it wouldn't be a problem. He said they now had clothes, supplies, and everything they needed. Excited, Ranta mentioned that he had already acquired a special skill to take down any enemy in his path. The protagonist agreed with Manato, but then Ranta noticed something unexpected: a small wooden sculpture made by Moguzo. Surprised by his friend's talent, he said they could sell it for some money. Moguzo, however, replied that he had never thought of that. He carved wood just as a way to relax. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Yume was advising Shiju to try to overcome her fear of boys. She said Shiju should talk to them more, as she was worried to see her so withdrawn and almost always isolated. Although he initially had something else in mind to share, Manato ended up revealing that he was the one who felt grateful to everyone. He acknowledged that he didn't know what would have happened if his companions hadn't been by his side. The protagonist remarked that he probably would have sought help from another group and gone with them, but Manato didn't believe that. He admitted he was never good at getting along with others, and that, without that group, he might not even have any friends. The protagonist smiled and listened in silence, as it was thanks to their combined efforts that they had not only reached that place, but were also still alive. With this feeling of mutual gratitude, they decided to rest. Before closing his eyes, the protagonist looked up at the red moon in the sky. He then reflected on how curious it was that he had already gotten used to it. He now understood that, over time, people adapt to where they are. A few days later, Manato walked alongside Shu. The two continued in silence until, while crossing a bridge, Manato approached some pigeons to feed them. Shu watched the scene with surprise, especially when she saw him interacting with the animals so gently. He encouraged her to try it too. Although hesitant and a little scared, she agreed. When one of the birds approached, Shu lost her balance and fell. In a quick move, Manato prevented her from getting hurt. That moment broke the ice between them, and they finally began a conversation, which pleased Manato, as he had long wished to get closer to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist's group continued their mission, exploring dungeons in search of goblins. During one of the confrontations, Ranta used one of his new techniques. Even so, the attack didn't have much effect on the enemy. Everyone took their battle positions. The protagonist knew that Ranta wasn't the only one who had evolved. Yume had also developed a new close combat ability, and at that moment, she managed to land a deep blow on the monster. Seizing the opportunity, the protagonist activated his new technique and pierced the goblin from behind. Yume didn't seem too pleased about it, but Ranta explained that, as a dark knight, he was committed to the will of his god, which justified his attitude. Shortly after, Shu launched a black magic projectile at a goblin from a distance, surprising everyone. Manato then took the opportunity to skillfully wield his weapon, which caught the protagonist's attention, as it was unusual for a priest to handle bladed weapons. But Manato was different. He also fought on the front lines, which increased his importance within the group. Soon after, another goblin appeared and was faced by Moguzo, who used his new skill with enough force to hurl the enemy against the rubble. Ranta didn't waste time and finished off the monster with enthusiasm, proud to have racked up 3 more victories. This strengthened his bond with his demon, which as a result gained the ability to weaken its enemies, if it so wished. The protagonist observed and remarked that those demons seemed more useless than helpful, which irritated Ranta. He asked them not to mock his zodiac demon. Curiously, the girls found the summoned creature adorable, even though it was supposed to be threatening. Manato simply raised his eyes to the sky for a few moments before everyone resumed their march. Later, the group rested and shared conversations about the day's achievements. Yume mentioned her prayers to the god of hunters, always asking for success. When she began to explain her beliefs, Ranta grew irritated, thinking it was all nonsense. The argument, however, ended in laughter, especially when Manato declared that the group was getting stronger, capable of facing even 3 goblins at once, and, if they organized better, maybe even 4. Manato continued praising his companions. Moguzo had become a reliable and lethal shield. Ranta was fearless, which helped them move forward bravely. Yume was essential for her boldness and energy, and Shu now mastered healing magic, capable of locating and restraining enemies, a skill that proved vital in many battles. As they walk, the protagonist senses something strange and, upon glancing at a nearby rooftop, realizes they're about to be ambushed. He runs toward Manato and manages to push him out of the way just in time, but ends up hit by an arrow in the shoulder. The surprise attack alarms the group, and a second arrow strikes his leg. At the same time, a goblin larger than the others advances. Moguzo engages the creature, Ranta deals with other enemies, and the girls try to help, but Manato orders a retreat. It was a trap, and they had to escape. The group quickly runs to a secret passage they had previously discovered. They manage to get through just as a stone falls, blocking the entrance and preventing the monsters from pursuing. However, one goblin manages to shoot and hits Manato in the head. He falters for a moment but assures the others he's fine. They keep going. After escaping the ruins, everyone tries to catch their breath, but they soon realize that Manato has collapsed. As they approach, they see a sword plunged into his back. The shock is immediate. The protagonist helps him lie down gently and begs him to use his healing magic. Manato, however, confesses that he no longer has enough energy. With a tired gaze, he apologizes to the protagonist and says he trusts him. Then, he closes his eyes. Desperate, the protagonist demands they do something to stop the bleeding. They manage to reach the Healer's Guild, where they find Manato's master. The protagonist rushes to him, bows, and pleads for him to save his friend. The man approaches and, sorrowfully, says it's too late. Nothing can be done for someone who's already passed. The news leaves everyone in shock. The protagonist refuses to believe it, insisting there must be some mistake. They brought him here. He couldn't accept that his friend and leader had died like that. The priest then warns them they must cremate Manato as soon as possible. If they fail to give him a proper burial, his body may be corrupted by the region's curse and become a servant of the lifeless king. The possibility left the group even more shaken. Shu began to cry uncontrollably, and the protagonist whispered to ask how much the procedure would cost. The priest answered in silence. He could very well cover the expenses, being their master. However, the protagonist, agitated, firmly refused the idea. He couldn't accept it, because Manato wasn't just a teacher or a leader. He was a friend, and for that reason, all of them, as companions, should be the ones responsible for saying goodbye to him. Shortly after, the weight of the loss truly hit them. Losing someone so essential, so present, left each of them devastated. A few hours later, white smoke from the cremation rose into the sky, drawing the attention of many in the city, who quickly understood. One of the volunteers had passed away. Even Britt, overwhelmed with guilt, mourned everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the protagonist and the others carried their friend's ashes and released them to the wind, as if by letting them go, they could also release some of the pain that lingered between them. The absence left a deep wound, hard to ignore. That night, they buried what remained of Manato. No one could speak. They stayed there for hours, wrapped in thick, heavy silence. The protagonist, lost in his thoughts, found himself reflecting on how even death had a price. Between burial and cremation, they had to pay a silver coin. In the midst of that grim muteness, Ranta suddenly stood up, saying he was leaving. Moguzo asked where he planned to go, but Ranta answered vaguely, as if it didn't matter, claiming there was no reason to continue, that it was all over. Yume, indignant, reacted with a slap. She wouldn't accept him saying such things, especially in front of Manato's grave. Ranta was stunned, maybe ready to argue, but when he saw the pain on his friends' faces, he simply backed off and left in silence. Sometime later, the protagonist and Moguzo found him in a bar near where they used to live. As they approached, Ranta ordered 2 more drinks. They told him they were there to take him back, not to drink. But Ranta downplayed the situation, saying even Manato did this sometimes. In the end, they ended up joining him, trying to ease, at least for a moment, the bitter taste of loss. In the warmth of drink and words, Ranta confessed that he no longer saw any reason to remain a volunteer. It all seemed like a big waste, and if they had come this far, it was because of Manato. The protagonist replied that there was no other choice. Besides, Manato would never approve of them simply giving up. Ranta, however, lost control. If Manato hadn't used so much magic to heal him, he might still be alive. That caught the protagonist off guard. He responded louder now, making it clear that no one was to blame. They were all trapped in that situation together, and no one could have predicted what happened. But the shouting drew the attention of others in the bar. Moguzo, irritated, slammed the table, spilling some of the drinks. He ordered them to stop. They were comrades, and there was no reason to fight each other. He also reminded Ranta that living costs money. Eating, sleeping, all of it has a price, and that he couldn't just abandon the Knights Guild. At that moment, a boy appeared, greeting them cheerfully. It was Kika, someone they knew. He mentioned that Manato had told him they were at the ruins of the old city, but he hadn't heard anything since. The protagonist revealed, with sorrow, that Manato had died the day before. Kika was saddened by the news, recognizing that he had been a brave man and an excellent soldier. He explained that he was now part of Toku's group, a capable leader, and offered to introduce them. However, noticing the heavy atmosphere among his old companions, he backed off, saying he understood completely. Manato wasn't just the priest, he was the foundation of everything. He also remarked that priests are always targeted by monsters precisely because of their gifts. That struck Moguzo deeply. He felt terrible for not being able to protect Manato. Kika tried to cheer them up, suggesting they move forward and find a new priest. But the protagonist didn't see that as something so simple. Who, after all, would want to join a group like theirs, so marked by tragedy? Kika insisted, saying he knew good people, and that sparked a glimmer of hope. The next day, he introduced them to Mary, a priestess. As soon as they saw her, the protagonist felt uneasy. Mary was strict, too firm. When they asked about her plans, she answered coldly. The group explained they intended to return to the ruins. That night, the group was gathered again. They were exhausted, not only physically but emotionally too, and they couldn't warm up to Mary. During planning, she refused to engage directly in combat, justifying that her role was different. Ranta was furious with her attitude and started an argument. Mary, with short and cold replies, did nothing to ease the tension. The protagonist tried to remain calm, but it was clear everyone was worn out. Moguzo also expressed his discomfort. The battle they faced that day had been a disaster. Ranta got injured in the leg, and even so, Mary refused to heal him, claiming it was a light wound, and didn't justify using her power. In the end, they returned without any accomplishment. The protagonist couldn't help but think of Manato. He was more than a healer. He was the shield, the brain, and the heart of the group. And now, what was he supposed to be? At that moment, Renji entered the bar. His presence immediately drew attention. His uniform revealed his high-ranking position. Renji approached their table, looked directly at the protagonist, and said he had heard about Manato's death. Then he extended his hand and offered a gold coin as a gift, but the protagonist immediately refused. He stood up, returned the coin, and said he couldn't accept it. Renji simply nodded, said nothing more, and left. While Ranta argued about what had happened, he insisted that the protagonist should have taken the coin. After all, with that amount, they could buy soldier badges. But Moguzo, with his usual calm, replied that he knew the protagonist was right. Manato didn't want them to earn the badges this way. Our protagonist, on the other hand, thought it would be best to talk to the girls. They hadn't yet opened up about what had happened since the death of their partner, and hadn't even considered the possibility of bringing a new priestess into the group. He knew that Manato constantly talked to them. After all, they needed company. A few hours later, the protagonist called Yume, trying to understand if she was angry with him. Yume, surprised by the question, wasn't sure what he meant. She didn't remember doing anything wrong. The protagonist then explained that he had invited Mary into the group without asking for her opinion, and that bothered her. Yume, in turn, yelled that he shouldn't blame himself because it wasn't his fault. She then started crying, but kept repeating that she didn't understand what was going on. The protagonist asked her to explain better, and she revealed that she didn't know how to relate or express what she felt, something that also happened to him. This left the protagonist shocked, but Yume soon said that they were all in the same situation. It wasn't her fault, but rather the fact that everyone was trying to be friends. That's how she saw things, and she hoped not to make more mistakes because, in the end, they all wanted the group to be good. The protagonist remembered Manato's words, especially the ones he had spoken to him, trusting him. This thought made him unable to hold back the tears, and he started crying uncontrollably. Yume hugged him, and they both cried together, relieving all the pain that had built up over the past few days. After a few minutes, now calmer, the protagonist apologized to Yume. He knew she and Shijo Deb were feeling very lonely, but Yume told him he didn't need to apologize, that she felt bad too, but felt safe in his arms. Together, they promised to try to get along better with Mary. The next morning, Shu opened one of the windows and saw the two of them hugging, lying there, not knowing what to do. She, very embarrassed, tried to close the window, but the protagonist hurried to explain, unsuccessfully. Shu, however, responded that he didn't need to say anything, which made the two of them even more uncomfortable with the situation. The next day, Shu apologized to the protagonist, explaining that Yume had told her everything, and that's why she thought they were in a relationship. Ranta, curious, ran over to them to find out more, but Yume explained that Shu had seen them hugging and misinterpreted everything. This left Ranta even more confused, as he didn't exactly know what was going on. The protagonist then tried to clarify, explaining that it was all just a misunderstanding. Later, during breakfast, they talked about what had happened. Ranta, somewhat disappointed, asked if that was all, but the protagonist suggested they treat Mary with more respect. Even though she wasn't the friendliest, they hadn't been very welcoming to her since she arrived, but she responded with a simple, "Good morning," without much enthusiasm, and said it was time to move on. As they headed for the ruins, the girls tried to talk to Mary, but she remained cold and distant, making the others uncomfortable. When they prepared for battle, they encountered 3 goblins. During the fight, some injuries occurred, but Mary shouted not to worry about scratches, as they were there to fight, not to dwell on small wounds. This bothered Ranta, but he remained firm and defeated one of the goblins. Moguzo, encouraged by Mary's words, finished off his opponent with a strong blow. Shu used her magic to immobilize one of the goblins, while Yume did the same, but one of the goblins moved enough to escape the strike. It was then that the protagonist, with a quick move, pierced the goblin at a vital point, defeating it. Ranta, however, was still not satisfied and demanded more from everyone, which caused some discomfort within the group. After the fight, Mary approached Moguzo to tend to an injury, apologizing as she touched his wound. The protagonist, realizing that she was taking care of them after the battle, felt happy, feeling that he was finally understanding a bit more about Mary. A few minutes later, the protagonist spoke about Manato and how he acted as a strategist and healer, always concerned with the well-being of the group. He wanted to know how Mary viewed this and what role she thought he should take. However, Mary was straightforward and said she had nothing to add. If they weren't satisfied with her work, she would leave the group. This left the protagonist disoriented, not knowing how to communicate with her properly. That night, the boys gathered at the bar, this time accompanied by Yume and Shu, who were surprised to be in such a crowded place and felt a bit intimidated. At that moment, they saw Mary arriving, ignoring them and heading straight to the bar. Ranta, irritated, didn't understand her behavior, but Shijo suggested that she simply didn't feel comfortable since she hadn't been greeted yet. The protagonist noticed a man approaching Mary, someone he recognized as a soldier because of the armor he wore. After a few minutes, the man walked away. As everyone was leaving to sleep, the protagonist, alone, went out to reflect. He read Manato's diary and realized that his friend trusted him, delegating the responsibility of leading. Although he didn't feel ready for it, the protagonist knew he would have to try. Manato encouraged him, saying that he should show the group his true leadership. With those words, the protagonist decided that he would try to be the leader they all needed. The next day, the group set out to face more goblins. For the first time, the protagonist noticed that Moguzo wasn't as confident in the fight as he was without his helmet. He then used his ability to attack a goblin from behind, but was injured. Moguzo, with a strong cut, eliminated his opponent. The protagonist also noticed that Mary was, in some way, praying for the dead, something that surprised him, as he hadn't imagined she was so sensitive. As they walked, the protagonist turned to Moguzo and suggested he get a helmet. He said it would help him fight better, and that he should consider using his money to buy it. Moguzo, however, replied that he didn't need it, that he didn't want to use his friend's money like that. But the protagonist insisted, saying that, since he was the front line of the group, he should be the first to be well-equipped, so he could fight with more comfort and efficiency. At that moment, the girls spoke up, saying they also wanted to help. But the conversation was interrupted when Ranta warned about the presence of a goblin. The group quickly prepared, but the goblin managed to attack the girls from behind before Ranta had time to react. Fortunately, he was quick enough to hit it with an arrow. However, the creature was fast and soon returned to charge, heading quickly toward the girls. Before it could reach them, Mary struck it with her staff, knocking the goblin to the ground. This left the protagonist surprised. He had always known that Mary stood out for her elegant posture, but she had never shown herself to be a fighter. Now, he had seen with his own eyes that she really knew how to defend herself, and still protected Shu with the same skill. After defeating the goblin, the protagonist thanked Mary for her help. But soon the minutes passed, and after a brief farewell, they parted ways after a day of hard work. However, as Mary walked away, the protagonist, on a whim, called out to her. She seemed uncomfortable, probably because of the direct way he approached her, but she still asked if he would like to join them for a meal. This left the boys surprised. Mary, however, politely declined, with a coldness that surprised the protagonist even more. She seemed to have something to say, but she simply walked away, leaving the group somewhat confused. Moguzo then commented that Mary seemed different that day. The girls agreed, saying they had also noticed a change in her. The protagonist in turn reflected in his mind, trying to understand. He felt that Mary wanted to say something, maybe even a simple, "see you tomorrow," an expression she never used. But if she did, it would reveal a lot about her emotional state. From there, he remembered that she had mentioned wanting to meet the boy from the previous night. When she said that, she seemed to expect him to accompany her to the location. The protagonist spoke to Shino, asking what he knew about Mary since she was part of their group, and he wanted to understand more about her past. Shino, with a serious look, commented that if they wanted to know about Mary, they needed to speak with Hayashi. He approached and began to tell the story. Hayashi had indeed been in Mary's group when they arrived as volunteers. When they joined, Mary was already in a group with her knight, thief, and mage, which made things easier for them in the beginning. In a few days, they earned their badge, thanks to mutual trust, especially since Mary was always ready to heal any injury, no matter how small, always smiling and being the pillar of the team. Hayashi's group, with Mary as strategist and healer, was well balanced. But when they decided to explore a mine in search of kobolds, things took an unexpected turn. Despite warnings that the mission was dangerous, they proceeded confidently until they reached the 5th floor, where they encountered a giant kobold, the fearsome death-spotted beast. Hayashi didn't remember much about what happened next, but the last thing he recalled was being violently struck by the monster and passing out. When he woke up, 2 of his companions were dead, and the tank was severely injured with no chance of survival. Hayashi asked Mary to heal the wounded, but she just turned away, crying and apologizing, saying she had used all her magic and could do nothing. From that moment, he realized that Mary had changed a lot. She couldn't bear the weight of losing so many friends, especially being the healer of the group. The protagonist was in shock. He had never imagined that Mary carried such a heavy burden, and it deeply impacted him. Hayashi explained that after the incident, Mary was completely devastated. Even though she tried to help the group, she seemed utterly broken, and after several attempts to continue, she eventually left the group. This was something she had never told anyone, but Hayashi knew that the pain tormented her deeply. Gradually, he realized that Mary was no longer the same. Now she seemed like an empty shell, and he didn't know if he could still save the real Mary, who had been left behind with her friends. Shino had also lost companions, and knew how much that could hurt. He warned them never to forget the pain of loss, because that was what kept them united and strong. On the way back, Ranta, as always, expressed his opinion, saying that, regardless of Mary's difficult past, it didn't mean she should be treated any differently. Everyone in the group had gone through hard times too. But Shiju disagreed, arguing that they couldn't compare their experiences with Mary's. She had gone through something much more intense, and that deserved empathy. The protagonist then agreed with Shiju. He understood what Ranta was trying to say, but he also saw that Mary's suffering could not be ignored. The next day, the protagonist was in ruins, and the rain made visibility difficult. However, he spotted a goblin carrying a dagger, the same one that Manato had lost. Determined to move forward, he prepared to attack, but Yume stopped him. They decided to wait, avoiding any unnecessary risks. The protagonist thanked Yume for her caution, promising to be more vigilant next time. A few minutes later, the group reported that they didn't find anything of relevance. Ranta suggested that they go back since the rain was too heavy, and the protagonist agreed. Before saying goodbye to Mary, he sought her out to talk to her. She seemed surprised but willing to talk, asking him to be quick. The protagonist felt relieved but knew there was still much to discover about the girl and what she really felt. The protagonist was surprised to realize that he was thinking this way, although deep down, he knew it wasn't uncommon. After all, everyone that day was acting stranger than usual. This was because, after learning about her past, they didn't know how to deal with her. She ended up wondering if, deep down, they might not want her in the group anymore. However, the protagonist decided to explain the situation, starting by telling her that Man had been the priest he had before joining them. But Man wasn't just that. He was also the leader and strategist of the group, someone with many responsibilities and even 3 jobs, who died trying to protect them. This loss made everyone feel guilty, but at the same time, they learned important lessons from it. After all, Manato was the one who united them as a group no one wanted. But now it had become something more, something like a true friendship. So, no matter the fights or arguments, they were always there to support each other, as friends. And now that she was part of the group, she was also considered a friend, just like everyone else saw her that way. Even Ranta directly says that he also considers her a friend, which ends up surprising Mary. Shortly after, they return to the city and say their goodbyes, although the protagonist invites her again to join them to get a Moguzo helmet. Although Mary refuses, she also invites them for dinner, saying that she can't go with them this time, but with a change in tone, expressing hope to see them the next day, which makes the group more excited, as it represented progress, even if small. Later, the group goes to buy the Moguzo helmet and other items, making the most of the rest of the day before resting. Meanwhile, Mary reflects on how lonely her room feels. In the following days, they continue hunting goblins in the city ruins, improving teamwork, and accumulating more money for Endo. The protagonist notices that, little by little, everyone is getting closer to Mary, who, in turn, starts trusting the group more. The progress is noticeable, and their bond seems to grow stronger. One night, while everyone rests, the other soldiers start mocking them for dedicating so much time to goblin hunting. This irritates Ranta, but the protagonist says that, although they are the target of jokes, maybe they are also right. What matters, he says, is to ignore the comments and move forward. In the following days, the group continues their hunting routine, and their unity only increases, to the point where Mary finally agrees to join them for dinner at the bar. Hayashi is happy to see that she is blending well with the group, but the protagonist realizes that, despite this, he still hasn't seen Mary smile for real. Despite everything, they all remain focused on their goals, prioritizing the purchase of good armor and weapons, as well as learning new skills. The protagonist, for example, learns a skill for attacking and another to move without being heard. Shu, in turn, begins learning a spell to put enemies to sleep. Ranta develops a skill to escape enemies quickly, while Moguzo acquires a technique to paralyze enemies with a shout. Yume, with her precision, improves her archery skills. As for Mary, she doesn't need new skills, as she has always been at a higher level than the others. However, the protagonist notices something curious. During a blue moon, he sees a path of light. Taking advantage of this vision, he follows the light with his dagger, and, with a precise strike, hits his target. He wonders what this could be and decides that when he returns, he will ask his teacher about this ability. When Ranta and the others suggest it's time to leave, the protagonist feels that vision again. Manato appears and asks if he's anxious, but the protagonist replies that he's fine, feeling at peace. He reflects on how, no matter where they came from, they are all friends here in Grenard now. As he watches the moon, he wishes he could show Manato how much more united the group is now. The next day, everyone gathers in the ruins, and the group teaches Mary the ritual they used to perform before going into battle. Ranta asks the protagonist to speak about it, so he starts by asking if everyone slept well. The boys respond that they did, but Mary is the only one who says she had a tough night. The protagonist reveals that he also had trouble sleeping, constantly thinking about Manato, as he feels a great desire to avenge his friend's death. He takes the blame for Manato's death and says that she probably feels the same. From now on, they are all friends and can't let anyone else be lost. Mary promises she won't leave any friends behind and prepares for the fight. Before going, Ranta, curious, asks why she calls the protagonist so affectionately, something he completely ignores. A few minutes later, the group approaches an area of the ruins where the goblins are gathered, taking a break. They stealthily move into position, and Yume shoots an arrow, eliminating one of the goblins. The protagonist also attacks one of the guards, but the fight becomes complicated, and Ranta ends up helping to eliminate the enemy quickly. Moguzo destroys one of the doors, attracting the attention of more goblins. The group continues advancing, defeating more enemies, until they reach a room where 4 goblins are waiting for them. Ranta faces 2 of them, while Yume shoots the last goblin with her arrow. However, the goblin destroys the arrow and starts fighting her. The battle splits, but the goblins seem strangely prepared for the fight. Shu uses magic to put one of the bigger monsters to sleep, but one of the goblins quickly wakes it up, and another enemy joins the fight. The protagonist realizes that he can't face everything alone, so Mary, determined, joins the battle. Together they manage to deal significant damage to the enemy, but the goblin counterattacks and pushes the protagonist away. Mary then heals him, while Moguzo, with Shu's help, manages to defeat another giant goblin. Finally, the protagonist follows the blood trail left by one of the goblins and reaches a room where he finds the enemy gravely wounded, on the brink of death. Ranta had said it was a life-or-death situation, but just before he could finish off the goblin, an arrow shot from the ceiling hit Mary's back. This filled everyone with dread, as it was the same as what had happened to Manato, although this time, it was in a different situation. Still, Ranta and Moguzo managed to finally defeat the wounded goblin, while the archer escaped through the roof. Desperate, the protagonist shouted Mary's name, who, with a calm look, apologized and assured that the wound was light. She asked them not to worry, but the protagonist, filled with anger, decided to chase the goblin. He managed to get close to him, distracting him, and soon recognized the dagger he carried. It was certainly the same one that had killed Manato. They began an intense fight, which took them to the edge of a roof. There, the goblin managed to overpower him and started choking him. At that moment, the protagonist felt the dagger sent by Yume, and, with a precise strike, managed to pierce the goblin completely, finishing him off. Now, he could finally rest in peace. A few days later, the protagonist and the others went to Manato's grave. He couldn't stop thinking about how short the time they spent together was. He felt that he would have liked to learn more about him, not just settle for the image of perfection he had. He imagined that, like everyone, Manato also had his flaws, but now there was no more time for such reflections. They were all proud, because they had finally achieved something important. They had defeated many goblins, and were now officially volunteer soldiers, with the medals they received as recognition. The protagonist couldn't help but remember how they had arrived there, hungry and needing so many things. Now they were in a much better situation, and he hoped to be proud of everything the group had accomplished. Although he was not the only one to feel this, Shu approached and said that, as the leader, he too deserved to be recognized. So they gave him more medals, crediting him as a volunteer soldier. The protagonist thought that Manato would have said that this was an unnecessary expense, but none of them cared now. They just wanted to reward him for always being the leader, someone who had been by their side. One by one, they all stepped away from the grave. The protagonist said goodbye to Manato, telling him that the group was getting more and more amazing, and left alongside Mary, calmly heading home. Along the way, the protagonist asked Mary how she was feeling after the injury. She replied that she was much better thanks to her magic, though she still needed to fix her torn clothes. He then commented that he wished the magic could heal clothes as well. This made Mary smile, but soon she asked why he looked a little down. She asked if he felt better after the revenge against the goblin. The protagonist replied that, actually, he wished the magic could heal emotional wounds too, since they had lost a friend, and everyone knew how painful that was. They didn't want to imagine how she must have felt losing 3 people. Mary was surprised, as she thought he didn't know her pain. The protagonist apologized, realizing that perhaps it wasn't the right moment to talk about it. But Mary, with a light smile, said that, in fact, there were wounds that magic couldn't heal, but thanked him for saying that, as it made her feel a little better. The protagonist wanted to say more, but at that moment the bells started ringing, interrupting the conversation. They said goodbye and agreed to meet the next day, as usual. The next day the protagonist woke up a little startled, but soon remembered that they had decided to take the day off. He went to the kitchen and was thinking about what to do when Moguzo told him that Ranta had left very early. This surprised him, as he hadn't expected Ranta to do something like that. While Moguzo prepared something to eat, the protagonist thought that, indeed, it wasn't a good day to work. Moguzo said he was still hungry and asked if the protagonist wanted him to make something. The protagonist asked where Ranta was, and Moguzo said he had seen him leaving with his fishing rod, probably going fishing on this day off. He also hadn't seen Shu or Yume, so he assumed the girls were still sleeping, something that wouldn't matter to the protagonist, as he knew Shu was still grieving Manato's departure and imagined they had stayed up late talking about him. Changing the subject, the protagonist asked what Moguzo was going to do that day. Moguzo replied that he was going to fix his armor and sharpen his weapons, which made the protagonist feel a little embarrassed, as he usually did that. But Moguzo, with a mischievous smile, asked what the protagonist had planned for the day, leaving him speechless, as he hadn't even thought about it. A few minutes later, he decided to go out for a walk, and along the way, he found Shu feeding pigeons on the bridge. He took the opportunity to talk to her and asked why she liked to stay there with the birds. Shu replied that this place brought back good memories. The protagonist then commented that it was here that they all watched the sunset for the first time. These words made Shu change her attitude, and she revealed with a shy smile that she would like to stay by his side for much longer. The protagonist was surprised, but replied that he also wanted the same. They stood there for a moment in silence, until the protagonist, with no specific direction, continued walking through the city. He ended up being surprised when he arrived at a terrace, where he found Mary. She greeted him and invited him to sit with her. Mary explained that this terrace was where she lived, a women's accommodation, and the protagonist felt a little uncomfortable, not knowing if he should bother her. But Mary said it was no problem, as it was a common space. She told him she had lived there since she left the volunteer soldiers' accommodation, and that if Shu or Yume ever left, she would let them know about this place. The protagonist agreed, thinking they would love to know about it. Mary shared some memories of the place, which made the protagonist realize that she had experienced many things with her friends there, something hard to forget. He understood why Mary felt so nostalgic and felt a deeper connection with her. Meanwhile, Ranta was resting, waiting for something to bite his fishing rod. But to his surprise, he saw Yume climbing a large rock nearby and was impressed by her skill. In the meantime, Moguzo took the opportunity to sleep. After spending some pleasant time with Mary, the protagonist and she decided to go for a walk, taking the chance to clear their minds and get some fresh air. The breathtaking view of the night, with the sea in sight, left them completely amazed. As they walked, everyone gathered again, and Kika mentioned to them the growing threat in the ruins. Apparently, the stronger goblins were circulating the area, and even some newcomers had gotten badly hurt. The protagonist, with a serious expression, commented that he had expected this. After all, the goblins they had faced recently didn't seem normal at all. He took the opportunity to discuss with his companions what they could do, as the situation in the ruins was becoming increasingly dangerous. The idea of going back there without gaining anything in return didn't seem like a good option. So during the conversation with Ranta about alternatives, Moguzo suggested an idea that surprised everyone, changing the location where they were based. This made everyone think for a moment. The protagonist, with a calm tone, suggested that the mine could be a viable option. Although they knew dangerous monsters could appear, with the right preparation, they could leave there with something valuable, and at the same time, gain experience in new types of combat. Ranta, who was starting to get bored with the daily routine, got excited about the idea. Changes for him were always welcome. However, Yume didn't share the same enthusiasm. She said she was satisfied with the progress they had made so far, especially considering they were saving and improving. She wasn't so convinced it was the best option for everyone. The protagonist, on his part, made it clear that he felt like going to the mine, as the ruins were out of the question for the moment. It was then that Mary, visibly agitated, suddenly stood up, her face showing clear signs of panic. Breathing heavily, she apologized and quickly left, leaving everyone behind. The protagonist, noticing Mary's condition, hurriedly stood up and followed her. A few minutes later, he found her at the bottom of a staircase, lying on the floor with empty eyes, as if in a trance. He tried to apologize, but Mary, in a distant tone, revealed that she didn't believe she could face the siren's mine. This place was full of painful memories for her, especially because it was where she had lost 3 of her companions. The protagonist, with empathy, stated that he understood the reason. After all, she wasn't the only one who wanted to forget what had happened in that place. They had avoided the spot where Manato died for the same reason. Mary, with a sigh, said that she needed to overcome this trauma. She sincerely asked that their help guide her through this process. The idea of being supported by those who considered her a friend brought her relief, something she deeply desired. The protagonist, touched by her words, couldn't hold back the tears. He wanted to embrace her, but held back. Instead, he thanked Mary for her trust and reassured her that they would always be by her side. The next day, the group decided to prepare better for the journey to the mine. The protagonist sought out his teacher, Barbara, to learn a more effective combat technique. The teacher, with a mischievous smile, said that to learn, he would have to endure the impacts of the technique on his body until it was registered in his memory. They began the training and soon the protagonist was exhausted. However, Barbara showed no signs of pity, pressing his abdomen to ensure that he continued strengthening himself even during rest. She also took the moment to ask him about something else. Curious about his relationship with the women, Barbara asked if the protagonist was interested in any of the girls in his group, since he was accompanied by 3 of them. The protagonist, visibly uncomfortable, paused for a moment before changing the subject. He then commented on what he had observed while facing the goblin, but Barbara, with a smile, said it was nothing special. She explained that some people were able to perceive certain phenomena, and that was actually a good sign. However, she emphasized that to improve the effectiveness of this ability, He would need to enhance his physical endurance, as she did, since she often saw these rays of light. This would require much more training. Days later, the group arrived at the entrance to the mine. Ranta, looking around, commented that it seemed like just an ordinary mountain, but the protagonist knew that many years ago, this location had been a strategic point for the human kingdom to protect the border. However, a horde of kobolds had attacked and taken control of the area. Thus, the group moved toward the new challenge that awaited them. Sometime later, they encountered the kobolds, and the fight was tough. The protagonist and Ranta struggled, as the monsters were quite strong. However, Moguzo, with a precise strike, knocked one down, and Yume, using a new ability, easily eliminated another. The protagonist, taking advantage of Moguzo's help, decided to test his new technique. With a well-executed cut, he defeated a kobold. Ranta, for his part, didn't want help, and used his newly learned technique, causing a kobold to be attacked by a wave of fear. The protagonist, surprised, recognized that only the Dark Knights were capable of using such a technique. The kobold, overwhelmed with panic, began to attack uncontrollably. Inside the mine, the group faced three types of kobolds: the common ones, the stronger ones, and the elders. On the first floor, the kobolds were of a lower level, but still, their items weren't worth much. Ranta, without care, began grabbing whatever he could, which made the protagonist reflect on the situation. He felt uncomfortable treating those monsters as mere enemies, without considering the respect the place deserved. Nevertheless, the group continued to advance. At one point, Mary explained that when they descended to the second floor, they would encounter stronger kobolds. Although the group was a bit apprehensive, she reassured them that the larger monsters would only awaken if something significant happened. However, when they were approaching a small cave, the sound of howling echoed. It was then that Moguzo realized something was approaching. They stopped in silence, and when they looked more closely, they saw that some kobolds were sleeping in that cave. Ranta argued that they could take out the kobolds since they were unprotected and would be easy prey. However, the protagonist couldn't understand how Ranta could be so insensitive. Meanwhile, Ranta began to explain how the Dark Knights functioned and their mentality, not realizing that one of the kobolds nearby had noticed their presence. A few minutes later, they were fighting a small group of kobolds again. With Shu's help and her magic, they managed to immobilize the monsters so that the other members of the group could destroy them. Meanwhile, the protagonist concentrated and realized that the light he had seen earlier was back. He relaxed his body, feeling the energy flow. By maintaining focus, the light guided him directly to the kobold's neck, and with the correct movement, he struck with precision. The kobold fell lifeless to the ground. Ranta then commented that those monsters didn't pose much of a threat. However, Mary replied that the real challenge begins on the third level, where the dare kobolds are, who wear armor and master combat techniques. The protagonist, worried, suggested that the group return to the city, as he didn't want them to trust each other too much and end up regretting it. As he approached Mary to check if she was okay, she confirmed, and a few hours later they all returned to her house. At Mary's house, while the others slept, the protagonist kept thinking about Ranta. They always end up arguing, and he knows that a fight is about to happen. He wonders what Manato would do if he were in his place, since he has no idea how to deal with Ranta in such situations. Though he didn't know him well, he knew that something needed to be resolved through conversation. So, he asked Ranta to step outside for a moment and talk. However, as he stepped away from Ranta, he wasn't exactly sure what to say. He began by asking how Ranta felt about the group, and Ranta replied that he saw his companions as a team and that he fulfilled his role as expected. He believed that, if necessary, he could handle an enemy alone without needing anyone's help, and that this helped with the organization of tactics. The protagonist, in turn, tries to think of something to say, but understands that he needs to be patient. He knows that just like everyone else, Ranta is also looking for his place within the group. He tells Ranta that there are things he wouldn't know unless they were told to him, since sometimes his actions become hard to understand. Ranta, suspicious, asks if the protagonist is blaming him for some misunderstanding. The protagonist responds that he can't blame Ranta or the other members of the group, as they are all part of a team and need to work together. Ranta, with a disdainful look, responds that he understands the idea, but is not very good at working in a team. He asks the protagonist what his weaknesses are, and the protagonist replies that he has many, but doesn't see any reason to tell him. This frustrates Ranta, because despite being someone who doesn't reveal his weaknesses, he desires to overcome them and believes that others should be more honest. He explains that he doesn't mind being friendly with the other members, as he believes they all pretend to be friends without needing him, and that his only role in the group is to do his part. without getting further involved. After the conversation, Ranta leaves without saying anything more, leaving the protagonist feeling helpless. He regrets not knowing how to communicate better. The next morning, he wakes up to the sound of Yume practicing knife throwing. Surprised that he had fallen asleep outside, the protagonist talks to Yume, who excitedly talks about how her teacher taught her everything about knives and weapons. The protagonist, happy to see her so enthusiastic, listens attentively. A few hours later, the group returns to the mine, where Mary uses one of her new skills. She summons a beam of light that weakens and slows down her enemies. This proves extremely useful for Ranta and Moguzo. While the protagonist fights a monster, he is shocked to see Ranta, with a single strike, pierce a caudal and nearly fatally wound it. Ranta, indifferent, says it would still die, which bothers the protagonist, as this is typical of his personality. Over time, the group manages to surround the last monster, but before they can attack together, Ranta, with a single blow, pierces it and eliminates the threat. Shortly afterward, they descend to the 4th level and encounter a surprise: several large crops scattered around the area, and even what appears to be a small farm with some animals. The protagonist quickly argues with Ranta, who is pointing his sword at the animals, but Mary, with authority, tells them to move away quickly. Ranta suggests they eliminate the kobolds, but Mary decides to take them to the next level, where the monsters have the advantage in open areas. However, when Ranta moves one of the traps and activates some bells, all the kobolds on the level are alerted. Mary, nervous, warns the group that the situation has worsened, as now everyone is on alert. At that moment, the group is surprised by the sound of heavy footsteps and the dragging of a giant weapon. Mary begins to breathe slowly, tense. The protagonist, from a distance, spots a giant kobold with spots, who is likely the same one that attacked Mary's group. Mary, paralyzed by fear, can't speak, and starts to sweat excessively, entering a nervous breakdown upon seeing the monster. Meanwhile, the cornstalks begin to sniff the environment, leaving the group with few options. Mary then starts recalling the day of the tragedy, when her companions greeted her kindly and talked with her, which made her feel very happy to have that group of friends. At that moment, Michi had suggested that they all go to the mine, as there were people interested in exploring further. He believed that to maintain control over the mine, it was necessary to seize opportunities and move forward. Mary was happy, as he was a good leader. However, at that moment, she hears someone calling her, which confuses her. Realizing it was the protagonist, she is surprised by his behavior. She quickly apologizes to the group as the giant monster passes by them, unaware of their presence. Mary then says that everyone must follow her to try to escape the mine. A few minutes later, they reach the 5th level, where the heat is scorching due to the metal forge area. This is where the cornstalks create their weapons. While the group moves stealthily, Mary warns that she knows a safe spot where she used to rest with her companions. She leads them through the ruins to an ancient temple, where she explains that it is an old church of Lumi Aris. Since the kobolds do not worship this goddess, it is unlikely they will approach the site, making it a good refuge for the group. Now gathered, the group positions themselves. Mary, taking a deep breath, notices a fallen staff on the ground. It was her weapon from before. Just as she begins to hear noises nearby, a discomfort fills the air. They huddle together, worried, and Ranta quickly grabs a glowing plant and throws it toward the sound. As the light spreads, 3 figures begin to emerge, approaching them. Although they seem to be the undead, the group soon realizes they are old acquaintances of Mary's, longtime companions now affected by the curse that plagues the realm of the dead. Mary, however, wastes no time and greets them, surprise evident on her face. How long had it been since she last saw them? She asks if they recognize her, but the undead remain silent, standing before her. Suddenly, a fire spell is cast by the wizard, hitting them with precision. Mary then makes a firm movement and charges forward, asking the group for help. The protagonist, observing the situation, remembers that Mary possesses a powerful light magic capable of breaking the curse that afflicts them. He knew that when she learned this magic, she certainly wasn't thinking only about the monsters, but about how to deal with such situation. He then orders the group to prepare to support her. Moguzo, quick, heads toward the undead, while Ranta and the protagonist, along with Yume, face the wizard. However, they are surprised when the girl casts a wall of fire, blocking their view. The protagonist then realizes that Ranta was being heavily pressured by the thief. He knew that, even with his skill level, it would be hard to hold Ranta for so long. But seeing the situation, he understands that more effort is needed. Much more, thinks the protagonist, observing Moguzo's struggle against the warrior. The strength of this opponent is immense, and this makes the group realize how much they still need to improve. Then, as everyone adjusts to attack, A fire projectile hits them, knocking them back. The protagonist, unsure of what to do, watches as Mary crosses the fire curtain with courage. Without hesitation, he follows her, facing the intense heat. When he arrives, he sees Mary summon her light magic, and the wizard, in desperation, tries to block it. But it's too late. The final blow is delivered by Mary, and with the purification, the face of her partner appears for a brief moment, a silent gesture of gratitude. However, this simple gesture breaks something inside her. She says her goodbye with soft words, wishing him a well-deserved rest. Mary, visibly shaken, can't hide her tears. The protagonist, realizing the depth of the situation, praises Ranta for the perfect coordination between the two, without them needing to exchange a word. Ranta, with an unassuming smile, responds that it's just common sense, and that sometimes the important thing is to let things flow. He then goes to help Moguzo, while the protagonist reflects on the wisdom of this attitude. After surrounding the warrior, Moguzo, with brute force, manages to sever one of the opponent's arms. At that exact moment, Mary arrives, using her magic to purify the last trace of the curse. The warrior, now freed, disappears. Mary, in a final gesture, embraces him, wishing him eternal peace. This moment, so painful and meaningful, emotionally devastates her. The tears continue to fall as she remembers the comrades who are now leaving forever. Thanking everyone for their support, Mary speaks about the strength needed to face what just happened. The protagonist, observing Mary's struggle, praises her courage, and Moguzo comments that the warrior was truly strong. He realizes now that he needs to train more if he wants to be up to the challenges they face. Yume, in a lighter tone, comments that she would like to have a wolf dog. This makes the protagonist reflect, thinking that if he could become stronger, he could improve as a leader. While everyone tries to regroup, something strange happens. Mary is shocked to see a new threat approaching. The protagonist barely has time to dodge a fierce blow. Without stopping, he moves at high speed, giving orders for everyone to flee. His command echoes through the air. Ranta, with skill, fends off the enemies trying to capture Shu, clearing the way for everyone to pass through the mine's smelting structure. But the pursuit continues, with the kobolds trying to catch up with the group. The protagonist, leading the escape, supports Yume, who is struggling to hold back the wolves with her arrows. But the number of enemies is immense, and soon the group realizes they are being surrounded by an even greater force. A kobold, in a brutal move, throws the protagonist against a wooden structure, which begins to collapse. Yume, with courage, climbs as quickly as she can. The protagonist, running through the falling ruins, is almost struck by arrows, but manages to save himself with the help of a companion who calls him to climb. Even with the intense attacks, he is surprised by the gesture of solidarity and starts climbing quickly, feeling the tension rise. But the fight doesn't stop. The kobold, determined to destroy everything, grabs a huge metal disc and throws it at the structure, shattering it into pieces. The protagonist, trying to grip his companion's hand, sees the effort go to waste, as the pressure from the impact prevents him from holding on. Ranta, seeing the situation, shouts for him to climb, saying that as leader, he cannot be left behind. "Don't die here," the protagonist urges, his voice filled with urgency. Ranta, in response, simply laughs, saying that will never happen. When the protagonist reaches the 4th level, he realizes that the structure has completely collapsed and that Ranta has been left behind. The group looks at him, now recognizing him as the leader. The protagonist, steadfast, stands up and says that although the best option would be to save themselves, they couldn't abandon a comrade. When Mary suggests a new path to reach the 5th level, the group decides they would never leave Ranta behind. They accept the proposal, while Ranta, with the determination of a true knight, challenges the kobolds. He uses his dexterity and the remnants of the structure to block their attacks, with a silent pride in his heart. The kobold in turn follows Ranta's trail, finding his bloodied helmet. But Ranta, though badly wounded, manages to climb to the 4th level where the battle continues. He takes shelter in the animal farm, watching them cautiously. He had always found these creatures somewhat aggressive, but now his focus was elsewhere. In that moment, he takes advantage of the cover his companions give him to summon his demon, who suddenly appears. The demon starts mocking his situation, saying that he has no way out, that he's going to die right there, and that there's no hope of escape. This doesn't encourage the protagonist, who only thinks about what he could do to get out of there. Meanwhile, Mary tends to his wounds, saying that the priority was ensuring that the 5 of them were safe. But at the same time, everyone knew they couldn't just abandon Ranta. It was Yume who spoke up. reminding everyone that, despite Ranta being a difficult person and constantly offending her, they couldn't leave him behind. She still held a grudge, of course, but she knew that if she were alone down there, she would also feel a deep fear. That's why she couldn't even imagine what Ranta was going through at that moment. Our protagonist, on the other hand, kept his confidence, believing that Ranta, with his immense will to survive, wouldn't die so easily. In the end, they all agreed to go after their comrade to rescue him. Meanwhile, one of the kobolds, surprised by the animal's actions, approaches them but is attacked by Ranta's sword, which prevents him from advancing. Even falling to the ground, the sword catches the attention of the others, who realize what happened. Ranta tries to flee, moving with difficulty but manages to hide while the group hears the sounds of the battle, recognizing that the noise could only have been caused by him, as no one else would be able to create such a commotion. This surprises the protagonist, who hadn't imagined that Ranta was still alive. In a moment of regret, Ranta reflects on several things he could have done before reaching this point. But at that moment, a giant kobold appears in the shelter, and a destructive impact threatens everything around them. Fear takes over Ranta, who does his best to dodge the attacks while trying to escape. It is then that an arrow strikes the monster's eye. At the same time, the protagonist arrives, and everyone is surprised to see that Ranta is still alive, even in the face of such a huge threat. While the group deals with the approaching rocks, Mary uses her magic to heal the wound on Ranta's knee, and the others quickly defend him. Yume warns that there are no more arrows available, so using her magic, she creates an impact that breaks the kobold's resistance, allowing the group to reposition. With this, they realize they have the upper hand. Minutes later, Mary tends to Ranta's injuries, and with tears in his eyes, he thanks everyone for still being there. However, the protagonist reminds them that they still cannot fully trust themselves, as the road ahead is long and filled with dangers. They begin walking toward the exit, and the protagonist reflects on what it means to be a leader. All this time, he had wished to replace Manato, but now he knew that this was impossible. No one could take his place. He needed to learn to be the best version of himself, and from there, focus on leading the group in his own unique way, without worrying about being like Manato. When they reach the first level, Mary warns that she won't be able to use any more magic for now, as she could only heal one more time and would need to rest. The protagonist understands, as Shu is also exhausted. They continue walking, and as they cross a narrow cliff, a giant sword appears behind them, hitting the edge. Fear spreads quickly, and Shijo uses his last magic reserve to attack, but it has no effect. The protagonist knows that fighting here would be suicidal, and escaping would be impossible in such a narrow corridor. Someone would have to buy them some time. Not knowing what to do, the protagonist acts instinctively. With a scarf, he tries to wrap the kobold's neck, ordering the group to escape while he sacrifices himself to hold the monster back. He asks Ranta not to disappoint them. What happens next is a dramatic scene. The protagonist feels his body give way, but before falling into the abyss beside the monster, he hears Ranta telling him to never give up. This brings back the willpower he thought he had lost. Even with fractures in his wrist and other injuries, he refuses to give up the fight. With renewed courage, he realizes that the monster, despite its monstrous appearance, was moving slowly. He advances with precision, skillfully using his dagger, and strikes the kobold's eye, temporarily blinding it. He follows a precise path, hitting exactly the vulnerable spot of the creature, making it retreat. The group is surprised by the protagonist's skill, but before anyone can question it, Ranta throws a sack of gold coins, saying the reward was his for having defeated the monster alone. 30 gold coins. The protagonist, confused, receives an explanation from Yume, who tells him that they had come back to help him and found him lying next to the monster. They decided to collect the reward and leave it with him, as he was the one who killed the kobold alone. Even Moguzo, who had lost his sword, decided to bring back what was left of it, making it clear how much he too recognized the protagonist's courage.